My name is Giulio. My name is Giulio Berruti. I'm a director in the climate team at BSR, and I will be your host today. For those of you who are not BSR members, who are new, don't know about us, we are a non-profit member network and consultancy with the mission of working with business to create a just and sustainable world. We hosted a webinar today in collaboration with our partners at CISL, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and Women Business Coalition. So thanks to our partners for being here today. And also a warm welcome to our audience to today's webinar, which is, as you can see on the slide here, Accelerating SME Net Zero Action, a call for collective action. You'll hear from our partners and guest speakers in just a few minutes, but just before we do that, I'll run through our high-level agenda so that you know what's ahead in this hour we have together. So, and even before I do that, just a very quick reminder in terms of logistics for the webinar today. We'll have around 30 minutes of discussion with the speakers and 10 minutes of Q&A. During the discussion, all of you participants will be in listen-only mode. You can start, if you have any questions, you can start typing them in the chat, and we can, our panelists can answer on the go, but also we'll have the dedicated time to discuss at the end. So type the question in the box and click send. You're all familiar with Zoom by now. And note that we are audio recording, as you might have seen in the beginning, so that participants who couldn't join will be able to enjoy the webinar later. In terms of the agenda, as you see here, we will focus on the theme of the SME net zero transition. And so we will focus on why it is important to support small and medium enterprises, which we define here as companies with less than 500 employees, in the transition towards net zero, and how stakeholders such as large companies and the financial sector, banks specifically, can accelerate that transition. And the work here builds on the a joint report and joint work that we have done with SME Climate Hub, BSR, and CISL over the past 2 years. We start with an overview of the barriers and bridges to SME climate action, focusing on the finding from the most recent SME Climate Hub survey, then introduce some of the key findings of our report, and then we move to panel discussion with our guest panelists, followed by Q&A and closing. I'll quickly intro the other people that you hear from on the call. My colleague Julie Dugard, who is a manager in the climate team, Peter Georgiev, who is the head of strategy and partnership at Ampetco, Claire McCartney from the Women Business Coalition, who is the manager of Net Zero and of the Women Business and the SME Climate Hub, Ola Olaofe, who is director lending and working capital solution development, corporate investment banking at Lloyds Banking Group, and Grant Rudgley, program manager for the Banking Environment Initiative at CISL. Warm welcome to all of you today. So I think we can move forward, and Claire, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and guide us through the survey findings.
Great, thank you, Julia. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire McCarthy, and I'm the Net Zero Manager at the Women Business Coalition, which is also the host organization for the SME Climate Hub. At the Women Business Coalition, we work with a core group of 7 nonprofit organizations to accelerate the transition to a just and climate resilient net zero economy. So we were really excited to support this work done by 2 of our coalition partners, BSR and CISL, to bring together the voices of SMEs, banks, and buyers in a conversation around financing the net zero transition for SMEs. Small and medium businesses make up 90% of businesses worldwide and employ over 2 billion people. They have very different needs and barriers than larger companies face. And so it's really crucial that they're included in this conversation around how we as a society move towards a net zero economy. Last week, you can go to the next slide, we released the results from our 2nd annual survey of our SME Climate Hub community, which we'll share with you now, and it helps provide some context for why this work with BSR and CISL is so important at this moment. We surveyed leaders from 344 small and medium businesses across 40 countries and a variety of industries who are already part of our SME Climate Hub community. So any business with fewer than 500 employees is eligible to make the SME climate commitment and join our community. The majority of our participants who responded to the survey had fewer than 25 employees at their company, so it's on the smaller side of the SME spectrum. And we asked these leaders questions around what they're currently doing to take climate action, what are the biggest barriers they're facing, and what else do they need in terms of support. We were glad to see, based on, you go to the next slide, survey data, that the businesses in our community were already taking action to reduce their emissions. 60% of them reported that they do already have an emissions reduction plan in place. Bear in mind that these are businesses who have already committed to taking climate action, so it is likely that these numbers would be lower for the average SME. But I think it's still encouraging for us to see this, and also that 32% of them have already seen their emissions go down. These have largely come in reductions in the form of reducing their waste and reducing their energy consumption. There's also been a focus for SMEs on employee education, so really trying to drive solutions at all parts of their business. Next slide. These surveys results did also highlight really this continued need for support, though. So SMEs reiterated that the lack of expertise, funding, and time are really preventing them from taking greater climate action. SMEs often don't have dedicated resources, either in the form of talent or just in their budgets, to implement net zero actions at their company. And so to move forward, SMEs simply need an increased level of support. They reported that they most need tools for measuring and monitoring emissions. We really found in our work that accessibility and credibility in these tools are really important factors for SMEs to use them and see value in them. And this was closely followed by a need for additional financial support, which we'll get into more detail later in the webinar. And another interesting finding raised, I think, was a desire for really a network of peer companies to learn from. So I think members of our community are recognizing that this concept of radically open knowledge sharing will be the thing that really helps us go further faster. And as we'll get into more later with the other speakers and panelists, these findings also highlighted that there is a major funding gap in SMEs to finance their net zero transition. So nearly 70% of businesses that we surveyed told us that more funds are needed to take action, or that it would help speed up their progress. But at the same time, 66% of them reported that they had low or no comfort that they would be able to secure the funding required to reduce their emissions. So really, SMEs, they know this is needed, but they're not confident that they'll be able to afford a net zero transformation, and they really don't know where to go for funds right now. And I think this is kind of this key for why the work we've been doing with BSR and CISL is so crucial. So our goal at the SME Climate Hub is to really listen to what SMEs are telling us, meet them where they're at, and connect them with tools, resources, and also incentives for taking action. We've really taken this approach to provide SMEs with easy to use, open access resources for their climate journey, and also give them the opportunity to make a credible climate commitment that's recognized by Race to Zero and a number of other partners. One of the resources that we already have on the hub is a financial support guide, which was developed in partnership with BSR and CISL in 2021. And this is a really great starting point that gives SMEs an overview of where financial support might be available, how to approach sources of funding, and also some highlighted success stories. So it's really exciting for us to continue to build on this work and financial innovation that Grant will share with you next. And I think from our point of view, it's really crucial to engage the bigger players like the banks and buyers and regulators, along with the SMEs themselves, to understand how they can best support SMEs on their net zero journey.
Thanks so much, Claire, for sharing these insights, and I'm sure Grant will guide us through the research insights, which link very well with this. There's a couple of questions in the chat, Claire, so if you want to answer directly in the chat, feel free as we go forward, otherwise we can do it at the end. So Grant, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Julio. And hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be speaking with you today. And I'm going to be talking to you specifically about our research insights on the topic of financial innovation for the SME net zero transition. The focus of this research was about solving for the problem of SMEs not necessarily having the financial or non-financial support that they needed to move quickly and effectively on a net zero transition. So picking up on some of what Claire was saying about financial incentives, but also other aspects around capacity and knowledge. And specifically what the role of banks and buyers, and when we say buyers, we mean large corporates, so the customers often of SMEs, what their role can be and how they can help. And with that, next slide, please. Wonderful. So what's the challenge here? Well, the challenge in the simplest terms usually gets posed in terms of a financing gap. Simply put, how much more capital needs to be reallocated from existing economic activities to activities that help move us towards net zero. So how much capital needs to be aligned with a net zero pathway? Now, many of you on the call might be familiar with the idea of decarbonisation being about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions refers to the supply chains of companies that are purchasing goods and so on and so on. And this is where the bulk of the challenge is. And that's because scope 1 is within your own control. You know, what are the direct emissions of your building? And scope 2 might be the emissions of something that's just one step away from you, like the emissions of the energy that you buy. So scope 3, this is where the bulk of the challenge is. It's in the supply chain. It's, just to put it in simple terms, if you may be a big pig farmer in the UK, you're going to be purchasing animal feed, and that animal feed will be coming along a long and complicated supply chain that may begin with deforestation. And that's difficult to understand and that's difficult to prove. So there is all these huge challenges in supply chains and around scope 3. And that's why here you see that a lot of the challenge to get to net zero is, in terms of the monetary challenges, is around that scope 3. And this is where we get to the subject of SMEs, because even if we get the major corporates to transition, and many of them have made these big commitments, of course, that's, as Claire said, a small percentage of the economy. And so in the same way that scope 3 covers off most emissions, SMEs are, well, they are those supply chains, and that is where the emissions sit. So we have to think about this as a whole economy transition, and that's why we end up with very significant numbers, such as 50 trillion. So that's why the numbers get so big, and that the challenge is really immense. Next slide, please. Okay, so with the calendar challenge kind of painted a little bit there, we were asking ourselves, okay, well, what can banks such as Lloyds Banking Group that Ola's representing today, and buyers such as Tesco, so big corporates, how can they help bridge the gap? And there are already some best practices, some opportunities. And, just to give you one example from the banking side, banks are particularly competent when it comes to assessing risk. At the end of the day, they need to assess the risk of getting paid and whether or not those that they've lent money to will default on the loan. And so banks can be very adept at factoring in climate-related risks. So that could be both the risks of climate change, but equally the risk of new policy and regulation that's going to create new costs for businesses. And so banks can integrate these risks into their lending assessments. And when they do so, it's an opportunity to provide knowledge to those that they're lending to about what would help them to maintain the current lending relationship in the face of these new climate risks. So that's one example of what banks can already do. And then as for buyers, well, many times the buyers, they'll have a sustainability team, they'll have deep knowledge in-house about what it's going to take to transition. So that know what it's going to take to transition. In the case of Tesco, those that they purchase pork from, and what the pork suppliers might need to show in terms of their transition plans and how they might be sourcing different animal feeds in the future, just to give you one example. And so what the Tesco's of this world can do is provide non-financial resources, practical tools, resources, sustainability insights to help enable climate action. Next slide, please. So we've already touched on a few of these parts already, but very simply put, SMEs are faced with barriers that do not face larger businesses simply because of their size, their number of employees, and their size in terms of their revenue diversification. It's a simple fact that many SMEs have senior leaders wearing many different hats and people across their organizations wearing many different hats. There isn't a whole team in existence just to address the challenges of new net zero related policies or the challenges of climate change. So capacity is a challenge, but we also face challenges around buy-in. So, there may not be business owners that are yet convinced of how climate and climate related policies are going to affect them. So there might still be some convincing to do. And then there's this piece around finance and time. So, are there actually the resources to make sometimes some quite fundamental shifts in business model to align oneself with a decarbonization pathway? So a few barriers, and I've mentioned some of the offerings that already exist, although they are limited, of course. So given that though they are limited and there's limited examples of best practice, but this gap to get scope 3 and to get SMEs to net zero is still so big, the purpose of the project was really just about saying, okay, what are some innovation areas that we can pursue in order to support SMEs, in order to make more progress here? And so in order to do that, we undertook some innovation sprints, and these included SMEs and banks and buyers coming together to propose areas where new innovation could help SMEs make progress. Next slide, please. Okay, so there were 4 different areas that we focused on during these innovation sprints. I'm going to cover the first 2 here and then the next 2 on the following slide. So these areas are what within CISL we would call the different ways in which change through innovation can happen. So one of the areas where we can accelerate change is by the provision of new knowledge or the creation of new knowledge. And often it's not about a big new scientific discovery or a big scientific paper coming out with a new finding that changes the game in any way. It's often just about saying, let's take knowledge from one area and make sure that other people are aware of it. So an example in the new knowledge innovation sprint focus that we had is that we very much need a climate readiness classification process. There are, for major corporates, classification processes that have already been developed, but there isn't the same classification process available for the wide range of SMEs that there are, using the sorts of language, definitions, and concepts that any business owner would be familiar with. So having a climate readiness classification process that used accessible definitions and that SMEs could plug into would be a helpful way of raising SME awareness, but also enabling them to understand that today I'm at 0.5 and I need to improve up to 0.2, 0.1 over time, and this is how I could do that. So building that knowledge for technology. So this is more more simple, if you like. New technologies, new technological innovations can help to accelerate progress. So a suggestion here was to have a centralized ESG data repository that was shared across SMEs, corporates, and banks. So the point here is that right now, big corporates might have knowledge themselves about where they have lots of carbon emissions, and banks might have that as well, but it's not shared between them or between themselves and particularly their SME clients. So there's a degree of sharing that is needed, and so some sort of centralized repository that enables this sharing, and that indeed is a safe space for this sharing, because we do have challenges around competition law here, but where there is a safe space for this sharing would be extremely powerful. So first point is about classification, if you like. You can see this with new knowledge, having knowledge transfer. And the second point is about, well, we need a piece of technology, in this case, a platform in which the data can reside. And there is the technology to do it, but we don't have the situation. Yes, thank you. Next slide. Okay, the final two innovation areas around behavior. So we can accelerate change through behavioral focus. So many of you may have heard of, a number of years ago, it was popular to talk about nudging. In the UK, David Cameron's government was a big fan of it for a while. But simply putting how to nudge new behaviors through incentives or through the provision of training or new information. So this is where we get the interactivity element of what you saw before on the other slides. So, okay, we have a classification, we have data. Okay, well, what does a roadmap look like that we can make interactive? And how can we tailor that for different archetypes of SME business so that then they can see their pathway going forward? So you can see it building up here. We're getting all elements of these change factors coming together. And then last of all, business model shifts. So this is a lever of change, is about saying, often the revolutions that happen in the world is because someone sees a new way of providing a service. We won't refer to the classic examples around IBM or Microsoft or Amazon, etc. But the big disruptive business models, just looking at things in a new way, again, building on top of these three other parts, well, let's create a marketplace that can incentivize certain action. So a marketplace to provide specific archetypes of SME with services and incentives that can support them. So once they're being classified, once they've linked themselves to data, once there's a journey that they can go on, what services and incentives might they be able to benefit from? And so you can have a marketplace for that where people could bid in services and in a similar way to a procurement portal. So this is a shift in business model, just in so much as that right now we don't have this marketplace existing where SMEs can procure these sorts of services that's linked to their journey. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so yeah, to wrap up, so you probably sensed it, even though we kind of try to, in these innovation sprints, split up the sprints by these different levers of change, behavior through to business model shift, we actually often just ended up coalescing around quite similar principles that lay it up quite well. So it wasn't by design, but I think it showed you where the minds of and the needs of the SMEs, the bankers, and the corporates was. And so you can see how this could probably all wrap together with be wrapped together with a user-friendly platform that was dedicated to enabling SME net zero action. So you've got benchmarking elements and classification elements, you've got the marketplace, and then on top of that, the opportunity to target financial incentives and to build benchmarking. So this all would require, of course, R&D, but it also, as I've mentioned, it also will require an enabling environment. And this is kind of where you reach this point of, okay, when you've done innovation sprints, do you start investing money in the solutions that have been proposed in the R&D. And you could, but we do have this challenge around competition law and sharing data that does need to be overcome with policymakers. But I think, again, we saw the need for this data sharing and the need for the building of a platform on top of that. Wonderful. Okay. So again, Julie, I think you mentioned Q&A. Should we do Q&A now? Or I'm going to defer to the chair. Let's defer to the chair, Julia.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Grant, for driving us through all these insights, which I hope our audience found interesting, as we did. I think my suggestion is to go to the panel now, and then so we can go to that, and then we can take the Q&A at the end. But please, if you have questions, feel free to continue to write them in the Q&A box or chat. So Grant will also be the moderator of the panel. So I'll turn to him just in a second. But before I do that, Petar, Ola, and Julie, very much welcome to our virtual discussion here. My colleague Julie will, let's say, play the role of the corporate, of the buyer, and Petar will represent the SMEs, and Ola will, of course, represent banking. So over to you, Grant, and take it forward.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I wonder, Julia, if we maybe stop sharing the slide at the wonderful. Thank you. And yes, first of all, we are welcome to everyone, and thank you for your time today. It's so good to have you with us. So I've got 3 rounds of questions. I'm going to start off with the first question. Please do just very briefly introduce yourself and where you're from and what you're up to. That would be marvelous. The first round of questions that I have is focused on your approach to decarbonisation. Now, for you, Petar, just that's specifically your decarbonisation journey and how you're approaching it. And then for you, Ola, and the bank, and then Julie for the MNCs, when you're thinking about scope 3, where those SME suppliers sit, businesses such as Petar, how are you approaching that? How are you approaching the scope 3 element of the decarbonisation journey? How are you thinking about that? So maybe Petar, if we start with yourself.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for the introduction, and hope you can hear me and see me well. So I'm just gonna start by saying first a couple of words about myself and the company I work for, so you get a better idea of our backstory, because there's so many SMEs out there, but of course each has its own background. So I'm the head of strategic alliances and sustainability at Ampeco, and we're a technology company in the electric vehicle space. So what we do is we develop a software which is being used by charging stations globally, and different operators use our solution to really conduct, launch, and scale their operations under their own brand. So we cover quite a lot of interesting use cases. We develop our product constantly, and one of our main goal is to keep ourselves at the forefront of innovation in our industry. We're a company that was founded in 2018, so that's less than 5 years ago, and we have decided to not just deliver the features that we do and impact other businesses in their decarbonization journey, but also try to reduce as much as possible our emissions and make our process more sustainable, so that we set ourselves really for sustainable growth going forward, and we want to be a resilient company in that. We already possess quite a lot of ingredients on how to do that, meaning how to reduce our digital emissions, and we work with cloud providers. As you mentioned, the scope 3 emissions are quite major for us. For it, it's about 95% of all emissions, and we were able to calculate that quite easily with the help of the SME Climate Club and the tools available there, because otherwise we wouldn't have the resources to dig into such toolboxes, such reports. As a technology company, we focus on developing our product, and this is the biggest challenge that we've had in the beginning of our decarbonization journey. how do we justify it? And I'll talk maybe in the later part of this dialogue about it. But really, to get started, we need to have this set of data and shared targets in order to make sure that sustainability is reflected in how we conduct our business and deliver value to really all connected stakeholders and partners. We are about to publish our inaugural sustainability report in March. And this is something that, quite a lot of people from our team were involved in. We're a company that has about 80 people right now. And we're currently forming a team of sustainability professionals. We're hiring right now, and we're going to try to develop a team because there's no team really. It's a horizontal process. But we need to have, this business transformation project where we work toward the goal of becoming more aware of what we do and taking action to be more sustainable as a company. We think that this is essential going forward, since we're also in the process of fundraising. We recently closed a round of fundraising, and our investors were also quite, impactful on our decision to choose that journey. So that's also some of the rationale behind it. But at the end of the day, we also need to have this for better business success and talent retention. Those are all things that were in our mind when we were going about it. And let's see the results and the findings and the process that will continue. We're just starting.
Great. Thank you, Peter. That's congratulations on having that as a publication, given you have eight people in your entire company. And I think that you mentioned there the investors being particularly impactful, but then of course also the employees being driven.
Yeah, that's 80 people. So we're
Sorry, 80 people.
Not, yeah.
I apologize. Nonetheless, still really excellent. And glad to hear the investors have also been impactful. And on that role of finance, just coming across to you, Ola, and how you're thinking about your Scope 3 journey.
Thank you, Grant, and good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Ola Ofe. I work at Lloyds Bank in our solution development team. And it's looking at sort of our clients from a working capital perspective and how we can develop solutions that meet their need as well. Lloyds Bank, it's one of the, I guess, the large 4 institutions in the UK. It's over 250 years old, so it's very well established and very well ingrained within the British society. To answer your question, Grant, I'd probably look at it in 2 different parts. So firstly, we look at our Scope 3 emissions within our supply chain activity. So that's things around operational waste, our own supply chain purchases, business travel, and we look to reduce the carbon footprint across our supply chain in that regard. How we get there, we have a code of supplier responsibility, so that defines what we expect from our suppliers to ensure responsible sourcing. We need to make sure that that's integral to the way that we do business, and that can hopefully provide us the platform to then service our clients as well. Because we can't just be talking about sustainability or net zero without taking action ourselves. We ensure that these environmental practices from our supply base, of which there are over 2,000 and mostly SMEs in the UK, we make sure that they are addressed through our supplier code of responsibility. We make sure that when we send requests for proposals to our different suppliers, they address certain things around the net zero and their impact on sustainability. We've also piloted with a third-party sustainability provider with a small selection of suppliers that gives us insight into their environmental management practices. And that's where we can build out sort of like corrective action plans for those suppliers to help move them towards net zero. And then the second aspect is looking at financing, right? So where we come in as a bank, right? And how we work with SMEs to finance them. So obviously our ambition is to work with customers, with the government and with the market to help reduce carbon emissions that we finance by more than 50% by 2030. So what we've done is we've set sector-specific targets. So for example, if you look at the power sector, we make sure that we try to provide financing for SMEs in the space of renewable energy.
So things around solar panels to help make that transition a lot smoother. SMEs as well, from a UK perspective, around electric vehicles, electric vans. We try to offer financing for those types of assets as well through our asset finance business to help them to, buy these vans or these cars that can demonstrate that they are moving towards net zero.
Great, thank you, Ola. I think it's really valuable to hear and to raise the profile of the variety of action that's being taken across the banking sector to incentivize and support the clients. At the same time, I know that the banks aren't the only source of financial incentive. Of course, the major corporates in the supply chain are also offering incentives. So, Julie, coming across to you, how have you seen the corporates approaching their supply chain engagement on Scope 3?
Thank you, Grant. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Dugas, Climate Manager with BSR, and I will represent multinational MNCs on that panel. So I will speak from a buyer perspective. We know that many corporations have set ambitious net zero targets to meet before or by 2050, and achieving these targets requires companies to drastically reduce their value chain emission, meaning Scope 3 emission, including supply chain and in some cases downstream product-related emission. Grant, you mentioned it earlier, Scope 3 emissions are usually a very large GHG hotspot for companies. CDP estimated that they represent more than 11 times the average company Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So to tackle the Scope 3 challenges, company can use a variety of strategies, ranging from low carbon suppliers to R&D to design out emission or to supplier engagement. This last one in particular is often a strategy of choice for corporates. When engaging suppliers toward climate action, companies usually define clear goals to structure the engagement and procurement processes, such as the implementation of additional sustainability requirements for them, some sustainability contract clauses. Buyers also define the right level of support they will provide, such as trainings, and incentives with mechanisms such as supplier award programs, preferential supply chain finance pricing. Finally, buyers can also set up tools to support suppliers' interaction and data collection. In a nutshell, several suppliers' engagement programs exist at different levels of maturity, though very few of those currently focus on SME suppliers. This is in part because of a typical multinational supply chain has thousands of suppliers, and companies prioritize larger suppliers by spend, whereas SME decarbonization will be very critical to achieve net zero.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you. I'm aware now, so that kind of moving to the next round of questions, I'm aware that it's going to be about challenges, and I was listening in all of your answers to hear whether or not challenges were going to be brought up, because it's always very easy in these sorts of forums to talk about all the barriers and the challenges, but I think everyone managed to keep on all of the positives that are happening, which is great. So this second question still does apply. So mainly focusing on the barriers to action, and beginning with you, Peter, which is, what are you finding your main barrier to, the best way of putting this, but to really accelerating your own journey towards net zero? Like, what are you finding the main barriers to that? And then kind of broadening that out to the banks and to the multinational corporates, thinking about your engagement with SMEs. So the SMEs that need support, how are you finding it challenging to engage them and to support them? So yes, Peter, beginning with yourself.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And I think the report itself and the discussion that we've been having over the last months, it kind of all boils down to the keyword capacity. Do you have the capacity to devote the time, or to really prioritize the issue? Do you have the finance and the fiscal setup that's in the right sort of mindset to go towards sustainability. What I mean here is we see right now, unfortunately, apart from the context of fundraising, which we were kind of seeing value to start similar practices and sustainability, and also connected to the social dimension of our employees and how we work with customers. We don't see a lot of fiscal incentives to justify our actions. So all the initiatives that we're taking, we're kind of doing them because we see the value, but we don't get the fiscal reward for it in a way. So it doesn't. So let's say we're in a business where there's quite a lot of fragmentation on the market still. It's a new business. There's a lot of new companies coming up, but not a lot of them. Probably, I would say a couple only that are doing what we do are taking steps towards sustainability. And we as companies that are doing that, we don't see the fiscal sort of reward of doing it yet. Could be because of some legislation and policy that is not existent, but also I think it's difficult to engage the companies you work with. And you mentioned also we work with other SMEs as well. Some of our clients, and quite a lot of our clients actually, are companies that just started their business. I mean, there are not a lot of networks operating of charging stations out there, right? So all those companies, I mean, could be big oil and gas, could be utilities. We work with those big companies, but they're developing this new part of their business now. So we also have to be very pragmatic, and at the same time try to really showcase the value of developing a product and learning how to use a product that empowers others. So really telling the story of how what you do now can lead to a lot of positive change in your society. When we talk about electric vehicle charging, one of the main points now is really the equity. So the ability for everyone to access this infrastructure. And that's something that we're championing in a way. We are doing some projects which focus, which we create through our solution that enable charging on streets with smart electricity tariffs, for example. And this is one thing that doesn't have to do with what we report or a tool that we use, but we're trying to do it through our product. And that's the way forward to kind of keep that sustainability message in our what should I say, individuality that we have as a company.
Thank you, Petar. Yeah, it's this is making me think again about there's a not just capacity challenge, but maybe an awareness building exercise here that still needs to happen. But it's squaring a circle. If you don't have capacity, how can you listen? It's a bit chicken and egg. Having said all of that, coming to you first, Ola, what are you finding the challenges from your side engaging with that SME audience?
So I think from a banking perspective, one of the challenges that's frequently cited by SMEs we engage with is it's just lack of guidance or lack of understanding about how the journey to net zero applies to their sector, right? So we've seen some good use cases where, for example, in the farming sector, they've got a plan to reach net zero. In the automotive sector, you've got sort of the government action to help move along in terms of having to stop petrol and diesel cars, new sales of petrol and diesel cars by 2030. So some of these SMEs feel like for their particular sector, they don't have that guidance and they don't know how that journey would apply to their sector. We've also seen in terms of time as well and lack of resources, and I think as Petar has said, a lot of these SMEs are, as we've said, and not to repeat what we said earlier, it's just, people with multiple hats. And, if they're having to deal with, the current sort of cost of living crisis, interest rate crisis and things of that nature, I feel through the engagement, sustainability and the path to net zero just falls down in terms of priority for them. And, what we're looking to do in terms of addressing those challenges with the SMEs is we're working with our large corporates because, again, as Julia has mentioned, a lot of the suppliers or SMEs are suppliers to large corporates. How do we work with those large corporates to make sure that we get specific teams that are actively engaging with SMEs, providing specific collateral that they need, or pointing them in the right direction for things around measurement? And how do we incentivize them as well to be able to adopt these sustainable practices? So as a bank, we work with the large corporates to offer a sustainable supply chain finance solution. And that's where, by taking simple steps, such as calculating your scope 1 and scope 2, can get you access to financing at a cheaper rate. So we think a lot with our corporates to develop these sort of solutions and financial incentives to help SMEs along that journey.
Thanks, Ola. And nice segue there, talking about supply chain finance and the collaboration there with major corporates. So moving across to Julie, that is one of the solutions that corporates have created, which is providing, if you like, discounted finance with their banks to the SMEs that are able to meet certain criteria. But in terms of the barriers of that the corporates face, what would you highlight before we even get to the opportunity to provide such incentives?
Yeah, so I would think that we have three main challenges for MNCs here. So I would start by saying that the long tails of supply chains and diversity of suppliers make it difficult for buyers to set and prioritize climate KPIs, particularly when sourcing may require adjustment to meet the specific needs of SMEs. As like Peter mentioned it, or Claire mentioned it earlier, SMEs has specific needs. Then we know that climate is not an easy topic, and usually procurement or category manager don't know where to start. So I would say the lack of climate expertise within buyers' operation is a challenge for companies. And third challenge I see for buyers is that the solution they come up with must be viable even for suppliers for which buyers have limited leverage, so such as those with relatively low production percentage of smaller contracts. So that's, I think, the three main challenges for corporates. And I think one thing that's going to be key for developing solution would be for corporate to support education and trainings on climate for their supplier.
Great, thank you, Julie. Julia, I'm aware of time. There is another round of questions, but at the same time, I know we were aiming for I think 10 minutes for the Q&A. So I think either is, I'm sure, valuable. I see some questions in the chat. Let me know what you prefer to do.
Yeah, I definitely would like to keep some time for the questions in the chat. Maybe we can go over for maybe 3 more minutes, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Absolutely. So I'll be a mean moderator now, and I'll ask the last round of questions. Just if you were to have just one bullet point on what you see as the most impactful role that you can play going forward with regards to accelerating SME net zero action. So for the bank, for the corporates, and then for yourself, Peter, we identified some solutions, but just what do you need? What's top of the list? What would help you the most? Because those solutions, that was quite technical, quite granular, platform-based, blah, blah, blah. What would be your gut reaction, the first one? So one bullet point from everybody, and then we'll go back to Julia. Peter, starting with yourself.
Yeah, I would say the shared repository of data. It's one thing that I like to compare our journey sometimes with the journey of a farmer in 2,000 years ago, when they didn't know how to farm exactly, but they had to learn somehow. And it was a lot of community learning. I think as we see what our peers are doing, and we want to also give that example to empower our ecosystem. So I think sharing the data somehow and facilitating that would really improve the efforts of all.
Awesome. Thank you. Glad to hear it. Ola.
So from my side, I think it's just continued access and provision of finance to help SMEs on this journey. So things around, so from a Lloyd's perspective, we have a clean growth finance initiative, and that's discounted lending for green purposes. So like I said, things around solar panels. If you apply for financing, we can offer a discounted pricing for that. We also have sustainability and ESG linked loans. So this is where we have general corporate lending to SMEs. If they have targets and sustainability performance targets, we align the pricing accordingly to see how they're developing. And then last but not least is what we've already spoken about, right? So collaborating with buyers to offer supply chain finance solutions with a sustainability lens on it to incentivize sustainable practices.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ola. And Julie, last but not least.
Yeah, so I think buyers can definitely help connecting SMEs to the practical tools, resources, and vendors needed to enable climate action. So we know a lot already exists, and sometimes SME are missing just the right connection to those tools. So I think buyers would be a good connection for them doing that, reaching that resources.
Great. Thank you, Julie. Okay, well, thank you, Julie, Ola, Petter. Really appreciate your time today and sharing your perspective, and speaks to that awareness building that there is both interest from the SMEs and efforts on the part of the buyers and the banks to support. Yeah, with that, Julio, Q&A.
Thanks so much, and thanks, Grant, for being such an effective main moderator. You really stuck to 3 minutes, so that's great. There are some interesting questions in the chat. Keep them coming, but I'll start with the first, and which is a very good point. How do you think the proposed knowledge sharing repository will curb the intentional undermining of net zero targets by banks in there? I don't know who wants to take it, but Grant, maybe you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to, just because this is you know, something that I'm very passionate about. I mean, the intentional undermining is that's probably another point of debate, but just around the principle of transparency. At the end of the day, we do want to make sure that science-based targets that both corporates and financial institutions are signing up to, and when I say we, I mean them themselves and civil society, that there is progress being made towards those science-based targets, that we are making progress on net zero. You know, we need to make sure that observable reality is aligned with the action that people are announcing that they're taking, that they're trying to take. And so a shared repository, you know, that is that no one has exclusive ownership over, and that can be utilized by and scrutinized by civil society and other actors, as well as be something that would almost certainly have to be an intergovernmental effort, is probably the key, one of the key missing bits of this puzzle. And it really speaks to a wider challenge around private versus public data in this area, and that actually public data about sustainability can have huge value to communities that don't have the resources or the time to access or digest that data, such as SMEs. So so many different benefits, both around transparency, but also around providing those without the resources to access data with data.
Thanks, Grant. And in the interest of time, moving to the next question around the reluctance of competitors to work together to accelerate action, which, of course, it's something we need to break. I wonder, Ola, if there's anything you want to respond to this, or any others on the call.
Yeah, so I would say there's a bit of a reluctance because from a banking perspective, a lot of the solutions that are developed, there's a certain amount of intellectual property to that as well, right? So banks don't want to share, you know, insight and ideas to new solutions that they develop. But I think there is an appreciation that once, you know, that solution is done and that and the client is being financed, essentially, the way banks sort of work together is together with a corporate or an SME, we tend to allow participations in that particular facility. So to give you an example, if Lloyds Bank was to finance a particular project or an SME project, we would obviously finance initially, and then we would work with relationship banks of that particular corporate or SME to have their banks come in and also fund that transaction as well. So I appreciate there's that sort of competitive edge at the start, and there's no cooperation. But I think once we move past that, there's actually a lot of cooperation within the bank to deliver something meaningful to a client.
Thanks so much. And anyone else wants to add to these points before we move forward?
Yeah, maybe I will quickly jump in here. I think from the experience we had with the 3 innovation sprints from last year, I think we've seen that MNCs, banks, and SMEs were very keen of working together, shared some learnings, and today there is a gap on that knowledge sharing. And I think this kind of work, the coalition work, are good way to open that discussion and to prove how valuable is that conversation between different interlocutors and participants. So I think that was very, very valuable during the work. And yeah.
Thanks much, Julie. And I know we have only 2 minutes left, but I want to make sure to put you on the spot, Claire, with the last question that Fran typed in. She's asking, or he is asking, whether the SME Climate Hub is not a good place to host a repository. So maybe what are the plans ahead for the SME Climate Hub?
Yeah, that is a great question. And this is definitely something that we have been thinking about. And in the coming weeks, we will be releasing our reporting tool. So a requirement of SMEs who make the commitment is to report their progress annually. And that is part of the Race to Zero pledge as well. And so when we're talking about reporting progress, scope 1, 2, emissions will be required. Scope 3 emissions, they will also have the option to report, and then also give some information about what they're doing around making plans and setting emissions reductions plans in place. So definitely a very relevant piece of all of this, of how we actually keep an eye on progress. So that is what we are thinking about with that. And I think too, like we hear from a lot of partners, this is such a crucial piece really to like have that insight, have it be comparable, and then make sure that SMEs have an accessible way to give that kind of information.
Well, thanks much for that. And I see we are at time. So maybe in the interest of that, I will close now by thanking all of the panelists and the speakers for the participation here, and also the audience. Thanks for your questions, very relevant, and for your active participation. So we hope the webinar was informative and useful to inform your action going forward. If you want to chat further, reach out to us, but so far, thanks a lot.
Thank you.